Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third episode of As Good As Gold podcast. Finally, we get to sit down physically with a guest and have a physical podcast. Now, today we want to talk about Singapore's inflation at 5.4% is still set to rise. I think previously in February, the inflation numbers were at about 4.3% and it just went up another 1 percentage point. I think that's a bit, David is going to share with us how this 1 single percent can mean so much to our savings and our money and even in our investment. What can we do about it? At 5.4%, whatever salary you're earning right now, right, it becomes 95% in the next year or so. I think that's quite crazy. But what can we do about it, right? Now, if you guys don't know what I'm citing, there's this BT article, Business Times article that states that Singapore's headline inflation, I'm going to be very clear, headline inflation is at 5.4%. This is not seen since April 2012. What happened in 2012?
It was the period post the global financial crisis where a large amount of money printing hit the system and it caused some transient inflation that drove prices up. It's a very different situation to now. Now is a much more worrying situation, frankly.
Right.
But look, I mean, on the 5.4% number, 5.4% in a Singaporean context is very high. And candidly, it looks like it'll go higher, and could be quite materially higher. Now, what I will say is that this is true all over the world. So, in other developed countries in Europe, the United States, their inflation levels are very, very high indeed now. And, it's extremely worrying for everyone in society. But inflation is like a nuclear weapon. It kind of, when it goes off, it hits everybody indiscriminately. And it's typically pretty poor or pretty bad for the poor and the middle classes, frankly.
Right.
And that'll be the case here in Singapore.
Is inflation always bad?
Inflation is always bad when it relates to consumer price uncertainty. Also, consumer price inflation, always bad. It creates uncertainty. It's just a universally bad thing. But we have seen massive amounts of inflation over the last 15, 20 years because of money printing. However, that has been viewed as universally good because instead of going into consumer price inflation, it went into asset price inflation, which made a lot of people at a certain age group feel great because their house went up in value, their stock portfolios went up in value. It's people who are your age and below for whom that wasn't good, right? Because you can't get access to houses anymore. You can't get access. So inflation is, I think a terrible thing. Some people like it because it makes them very narrowly within their own confines quite rich if it's asset price inflation. But consumer price inflation is bad for everybody.
Yeah, but many economists say that you want to maintain inflation rate at about 2%.
Yeah, many of those economists work for governments who are trying to erode their own debt. Right. So if you're a large borrower, like the state is, not in Singapore, admittedly, but in let's say Britain or America or France or Germany, the state is a massive borrower, and so what's the best thing you can do to get rid of your debt? Well, it's to inflate them. So basically, what you do is you basically debase the money supply, so you have to pay back less in future. It's great for borrowers.
Yep.
Very large borrowers like governments, or even people who've had large mortgages on property. They've seen asset price inflation push up the price of property, and they've seen that same inflation push down the value of their mortgage. So net, they're much better off.
Right.
But if you're if you're an economist who says, "Oh yes, we want 2%," they're saying it because they want that 2% inflation to help basically reduce the government debt pile. If you talk to private sector economists, they'll tell you something very, very different.
From your point of view, what if just take for example US, right? On a normal day, non-COVID season, US inflation is about 2.5% or so every year. Singapore maintains almost zero to usually doesn't even cross 1.5%. Why are we different?
Singapore has traditionally had a much more conservative monetary policy. And it's had a more conservative monetary policy because it's had a much more conservative fiscal policy. So the Singaporean government, as a general rule, doesn't borrow large amounts of money. So it doesn't feel the need to deflate its currency or deflate away its debt,
right,
to forge its currency, because it's not borrowing left, right, and centre. So it can maintain what we call a relatively hard currency, and it has done for many, many years. Which is why when I was a boy, I used to get. We used to go from Singapore back to the UK every once in a while, and I remember that the Singapore dollar at the time was worth something of the order of nine Singapore dollars per pound, right? So I can remember I must have been 8 when we went back when I went back to school in the UK, and I used to have pocket money here in Singapore of $1 Singapore a week. And then when I went back to the UK, I was going to get £1 a week, which was 9 Singapore dollars. I couldn't believe it.
Suddenly you're 9 times richer.
I thought I was going to be 9 times richer. But as it turns out, the price disparity was there was much more price disparity back then, and I was no better off. But now, of course, the Singapore dollar is 1.7, 1.8 to sterling, and that's a function of the fact that over the last 40 years, the Singapore dollar has been a much harder currency, and sterling has been frankly, an emerging market, banana republic kind of currency where they've done nothing but print money. And so here, the state has been very, very sensible in its economic policies for a very long period of time, and that's reflected in its currency, which has meant that Singaporeans by and large have gotten materially richer. Let's be clear, on an international perspective, if you earn $9,000, or let's say, $9,000 a month,
I wish
40 years ago, you would have been a relatively wealthy man in Singapore.
Right.
But now 9,000, because you would have had £1,000 a month, right? A lot of money back then. But now you've had $9,000 a month. That's like £4,500 a month, right? That's or more, $5,500 a month. I mean, that's a lot more money in terms of international goods. So you can buy a lot more from consumer products, or your food bill has gone down because they're all priced not in Singapore dollars, and Singapore dollars has been strong relative to everybody else. So, generally speaking, Singapore has had good fiscal management, good monetary management for a very long period of time. Right? We're now facing this blip. Right? It's a bad blip for sure. It's obviously meaningfully less bad than other countries that have been much more irresponsible
for
the
last
30, 40 years. But it's still bad, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's still bad.
Right. So in this article, right, it states that March's Consumer Price Index, or CPI, increased because of a few sectors. Number one, private transport. We're talking about taxi. I think by owning your own private car and private hire, right? The inflation spiked by 21.5%. Just 1 month ago, sorry, that was in March numbers, right? In February, it was at 17.2%, right? And this is, it states that it's because of higher car and petrol prices. Of course, we know that one of the most interesting statistics to come out is that COE is at $99,000 right now. I think for Class B, that's quite crazy, right? Then accommodation costs went up by 3.5% as compared to February at 3.3%. This is because many more people today are renting right now, and rent prices have went up as well. So higher demand, higher prices, right? And of course, also no surprise here, electricity and gas costs went up by 17.8% in March. In February of 16.7%. Food prices up by 3.3%. So everything went up. Food went up, gas went up, living went up, transport went up. So why is everything going up? Especially in crises like we're talking about like Russian-Ukraine crisis, we're talking about COVID pandemic. Why does all these numbers go up?
Well, you've literally said why. I mean, at the end of the day, the supply-demand curve meets when supply equals demand, and that sets prices, theoretically, from an economic perspective. When you interrupt either supply or demand, both of which is happening at the moment, prices tend to move quite a lot. So from the supply side shocks, there have been problems with energy supply, there's been problems with food supply, there's been, all of this has been caused by war in effect. There have been problems with and the ancillary sanctions that have fallen off those wars. So those are supply side shocks, and they're massive. I mean, they are massive. And by the way, they're not necessarily temporary. They can run through into the system, they can become self-reinforcing, and they can change prices forever. There's also demand factors that change. The demand factors come from, for example, changing the supply of money. So what you see is the demand function is impacted by money printing, and we've seen that demand function change very significantly over the last 15 years by money printing. Actually more, 20 years, but it didn't matter to us. And it didn't matter to us because the supply function, supply curve, was being pushed down. So this is the one component of international politics that most people will ignore.
So recently, right, I went to eat at a hawker center, and to no surprise, my plate of chicken rice went up by $1. My drink went up by 50 cents. I took Grab recently, and what used to be maybe a trip that cost me $10 now cost me $14, right? So, and of course, there is this trend of wage stagnation in Singapore because, it's just not as easy. I mean, it's not easy for employers to raise wages right now when we are not out of the woods yet. And if our wages are staying stagnant, costs are going up, then what can Singaporeans do against this impact?
I mean, frankly, there's not much one can do. This is the problem with inflation, and one of the reasons why it's so important that governments, in aggregate, are incredibly responsible with their fiscal and monetary policies to keep a handle on inflation. Because once inflation arrives, there's nothing that the average person can do. Basically nothing. They can consume less. Right? That's really not much of a solution, right? As in, quite literally, consuming less is the equivalent of me saying to you, eat less chicken rice and take the bus. It's not a great solution, and no one wants to hear that. And candidly, you're in a very happy position because you can take the bus and you can eat less chicken rice.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But if you're in that segment of society where you're already taking the bus and you're already eating less chicken rice, then you get to the point where what is the solution? Well, the solution is I walk or I starve.
It just gets worse, right?
Now that isn't a problem in Singapore, right? No one in Singapore is going to starve, but in other parts of the world, people will starve, and that is a problem. And so it's also a real issue, because for the last sort of 40 years, we've had an enormous benefit for very poor countries, where frankly malnutrition rates, education, everything has improved in very poor countries for the last 40 years. The level of people who are living in absolute poverty has dropped by about 80%. These things are fabulous. This will be the first time in 40 years where you see a reversal of that trend, right? And that will cause instability, right? It'll cause political instability in poor countries. You're already starting to see it, right? Even in there's just instability. It's a bad thing. Now again, we're very lucky in Singapore when we're very unlikely to witness that type of activity. But the question is, what can you do as an individual? Well, you can consume less, and it's a very, very unpalatable piece of advice, frankly, because no one wants to say, tighten your belts. No one wants to receive that advice, but that's basically what one can do.
So of course, I can eat less chicken rice. I can not buy from certain cafes for my caffeine fix. I can go to somewhere cheaper. I can wake up earlier just to take the bus and reach work on time. Other than these cost-cutting measures, in terms of our savings, our investments, what can we do?
So certainly within the savings profile, because there's two components to this. The first is, what does your daily life look like? Second is, what does your long-term outlook look like? So you've certainly got to continue saving. You can't stop that. That has to maintain. So from a lifestyle perspective, you've got to suck it up and frankly consume less, which is incredibly unpalatable, and we all hate doing this. We're doing it ourselves, so we know what it's like. But one has to do that. For one's savings your portfolio needs to be modified so that it's much more able to deal with inflation. Now, there are traditional inflation protecting assets, right? Gold is one of them. Property is another. Property's already seen an enormous run, so I think property is probably a bad choice. Equities. Generally speaking, equities are a good protection against certain benign forms of inflation. And frankly, we haven't had a particularly buoyant equity market in Singapore for a long time. So I think those things you could look at. You don't want to be in bonds. You don't want to be in bonds, because bonds, bonds are benefited from the people who issue debt. They benefit from inflation, right? The people who own the debt that's been issued, they're worse off by the corresponding amount. The other people are better off. You don't want to have debt. You don't want to have bonds, because bonds are the other side of the debt equation. So no, it's really equities to some extent and gold. That's what you're looking for. I would have said property traditionally, but property yields are so low in Singapore that it frankly makes a terrible investment.
Talking about property, yesterday I was around a conservation area, and my dad was telling me in his younger days, one of those apartments would cost $28,000. And guess the price right now on Property Guru?
500.
1 million.
Wow.
It went from 28,000 to 1 million, I think within a span of 40, 50 years. Sure, it's a long time, but the multiplication is...
Well, again, that's a problem. That's an issue that relates to asset price inflation. So the Singapore government has its monetary policies have kept consumer price inflation low, right? So they've been successful at that to some extent. Although monetary policy here is, it's not as transparent as in other economies. A lot of what goes on in the MAS monetary policy department is governed by the Official Secrets Act and stuff like that. So it's not quite as open as other countries, which is fine, because candidly it's been much more successful than other countries, I think. But what you can say is that they have clearly been successful at managing consumer price inflation. they have been much less successful because perhaps they haven't been trying at all to look at managing property prices. Now, to my mind, that's a mistake, right? Because property shouldn't be viewed as an investment, it should be viewed as a consumer good that everybody needs, right? So you would not be pleased if, you know, every time you had to buy a new pair of shoes, you know, the price of them went up. Candidly, you're going to have to live in a house for the rest of your life, and you're going to have to move every a lot of times. Going up, you know, the price going up just means you've got to pay more for the more for it as you go along. It's not such a great thing.
Yeah, and we're still like right now in the resale market is like buying a pair of old shoes from somebody on Carousel, and it's actually more expensive than if I were to buy it from the store.
Yeah, so again, this is where the government's policies are, you know, there's a sort of slight mismatch, frankly.
Yeah, those with property, right? They would be those who currently own property or going to, in a very near future, would be the boomers who already have it. The Gen Xers. So the boomers will probably be in their retirement home already. I don't think they're gonna move house anytime soon. Then you have the Gen Xers, the millennials like myself, who are buying our first home, living in our first home, or going to move out of our first home. And of course the Gen Zs who are still some ways away before owning their own home. In your view, now that our inflation is at 5.4%, in your view, what should these people do now according to the age group, starting with, let's say, the boomers who are in retirement mode?
Well, so the boomers have no choice. They will be selling their property because at that point in life, you're always divesting yourselves of your assets in order to pay for your retirement because you're not earning anymore. So they'll be doing that. The Gen Xers, most of those guys will be on the housing ladder already. They'll be paying off their mortgages, this, that, and the other. I mean, the reality of it is that if inflation is going up massively, what you really want to do is pay your mortgage off more slowly, because inflation will get rid of quite a lot of it for you. So you basically want to slow down your mortgage repayments, let inflation take care of it for you, and then pay back later. It's just a lot cheaper. Unless, of course, you know, you're not on a fixed term mortgage or something like that. If you've got a fixed term mortgage, you know, don't prepay is what I'm saying. For guys like you, I mean, candidly, what choice have you got? You're in a situation where you've got property that is sky high, and that you can't afford. Well, the last thing on earth you want to do is make that trade down. I mean, what you can do is save more and more and more, and hope that the divestment from boomers will ultimately depress the property market, and property market fundamentals re-emerge. I mean, it's frankly ridiculous that property in Singapore has a yield of less than 1%, more or less. Right? I mean, if you reverse that and you start thinking of it in terms of a stock market asset, people always used to look at a stock market asset, they said, oh, okay, it's trading at 20 times a PE of 20, right? Well, that's quite expensive. PE of 30, very expensive. Well, if you invert the property yield price, which is, let's say, 1% at the moment in Singapore, well, that's a price-earnings ratio of 100. That's 3 times what people would consider expensive in the stock market. So, you know, the idea that people will sit there back and go, well, take comfort in the idea that Singaporean property never falls. Well, there's always a first time for everything. And in any event, that claim is incorrect anyway, because we had a big drop in property during the Asian financial crisis.
How about the Gen Zs, the ones who are still studying uni now or in NS? What can they do?
Save now. Start saving now. Right? I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot is the $7 millionaire concept. You know, the premise of this is you save $7 for a lifetime. starting at 20 and ending at 70, you'll end up with $1 million, right? So $7 in there. But the key important premise of this is that you end up with $1 million at the end of it by just doing this $7 every day saving, because of the massive impact of compounding. Now, if you start at 30 versus 20, you'll only end up with 620,000.
If I start at 30.
If you start at 30,
Okay.
because of in effect, the first 10 years of that 50-year journey ends up providing you almost 40% of the value of your savings at the end. And that's because it has 40 years of additional compounding, right? It's very, very powerful. And so if you're a Gen Z, start saving now. Doesn't matter how little it is. Do something small, meaningful, and regularly. You know, little, early, often is the mantra.
Would you recommend gold?
Yeah, you've got to put some money into gold. The thing about gold is that, you know, it's a little bit volatile in the very short term, but over the long term, it tends to track inflation, which is a good thing, particularly in this environment. But more importantly, it's immediately liquid. So if you change your mind, you can put it into something else. And very fortunately, we'll have other things for people to put in very soon. Mutual funds, that type of thing. So, you know, there's a lot that can be. There's a lot that people can do with their savings. There's not an awful lot that people can do with their daily life. But one of the things that we constantly tell people is, for goodness sake, please, 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 do not try and time the market. It will not work. Average into the market over a long time and you'll be fine. So gold is up, gold is down. It shouldn't matter, because over 30 years while you're saving into gold, all that you can be very certain of is that gold will be a much higher price in 30 years' time. You know, I don't know what it is, but there are people who have this kind of gambler's mentality at their core, right? Which is, I can beat the market.
Right.
You know, trying to time the gold price or trying to time specific market prices is a little bit like going into a casino and betting on red. And well, it was red last time, so I'm going to do black this time. They're completely unrelated, right? But this is human behavior. We're dealing with human behavior. All we can do is just remind people, do what's good for you, do what's good for you, do what's good for you. Try and avoid, you know, obviously bad things, even if they are beguiling or they sort of fall into some degree of fuzzy logic. Just keep following the plan. Average in, average in, average in, average in. In an inflationary environment, you can average more into gold than you can into bonds. That's a sensible thing to do, you know. But it's still all about, you know, long-term strategic decisions, not short-term gambling.
Right.
I mean, we see this a lot. You know, there's a lot of, gambling. Retail gambling is in effect illegal in Singapore, right? I mean, there's obviously the toads and there's the casino, but you don't have horse race betting, you don't have sports betting. You know, you're on your phone, you can't do it. This has been supplanted by financial apps, which effectively allow people to take large levered bets on an intraday basis in order to try and get that gambling fix. We're not one of those. We don't want to be part of that at all. And so we always try to tell people, just make the long-term decisions. If you want to play a game, right, play Wordle. Something that doesn't have such a negative impact on you. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
You know, that's sort of it.
So, final word. Do you think this inflation is going to abate anytime soon?
No.
You don't think so?
No.
It's going to keep going and above for
A long time.
how long? Your guess?
Until we get until we get interest rates at 7%. I mean, maybe not necessarily 7% in Singapore, but we have to get positive interest rates. So we've got 5% inflation here. We need positive interest rates. That means 6, means 7. I mean, maybe inflation falls off a little bit, but we need higher interest rates to curb this. Whether we'll get them or not is another matter, and I don't think we are going to get them. So my view is that we're in that period where inflation will run quite a long way ahead of interest rates for a long time.
Right.
And so I think we'll be dealing with the impact of inflation for a while. And by that I mean years, not months.
Well, there you go.
I'm sorry to have to say.
Inflation is gonna, according to David, his view is that inflation is going to continue in this trajectory for quite some time. So let's continue to spend wisely, save much more often if you can. I'm already saving quite often, right? For those who maybe find yourself unable to save more because of your financial situation or your circumstance, I highly recommend that you download Hugo Save and start using Hugo Save, because when you use the Hugo card to spend on your necessities, right, the app helps you to save in little ways and invest that into gold. And like what David said, it is a part of your averaging into gold strategy. And as gold prices go up, so do your savings. As inflation go up, so do gold prices, and that correspond. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you, David, for being on a third podcast and the first physical guest that I have. Right now, stay tuned for the fourth episode because I'm gonna have quite a special guest lined up. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
All opinions in this podcast should not be regarded as offering any financial advice. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified financial advisor regarding the suitability of any financial strategy, taking into account their specific financial objectives, situation, or particular needs before they act upon any recommendation.